News outlets across the UK and indeed the world have been reporting today a fairly amazing British scientific breakthrough that promises limitless cheap energy that produces no carbon footprint. It's the Shangri-La of energy policy, nuclear fusion. It moved, we're told, a step closer with results from a massive ongoing physics experiment attached to Oxford University. But it won't be producing electricity commercially tomorrow or even in the next decade. More likely is the second half of this century. But what do we do in the meantime? Jacob Rees-Mogg, the Brexit Opportunities Minister, as he is now, says it's time for Britain to look again at fracking. Does he have a point? Joining me, Richard Tice, leader of Reform UK. Richard, thanks so much for coming into the studio. Appreciate it. Fracking, we're over fracking. It causes earthquakes. Move on.
Nonsense. Firstly, fracking is the process of extracting shale gas from the ground. The asset, the value, is the shale gas. And there are different ways of getting gas out of the ground. And the exciting thing is that, despite all the myths people have heard about fracking, engineers, they change things, they design new things. And guess what, Colin? I've discovered that actually there are other ways to extract shale gas out of the ground, new technologies, new things being patented that are starting to be used or going to be used later this year. That means, whatever you think about fracking, the rights and the wrongs, if you can do it using a different technology, then why wouldn't we look at extracting the £1 trillion worth of shale gas treasure that we all own that's under our feet? £1 trillion. That's like, if I said to you, you can cancel half of the mortgage on your house, because £1 trillion is half the national debt, and you say, no, I'm going to leave it in the cellar. Don't want that, Richard. I'm not going to look at it. That's absurd. OK? So we've got this huge treasure. We need to look at these new technologies, and we should invest in them, because that's how we make progress. Yeah. And that, you design things, you tweak it, you change it. I think it's very exciting. Jacob Rees-Mogg is quite right. We need to relook at shale gas. Don't get hung up on the process. Say, look, there's this treasure. It's increasingly valuable because of what's happened to gas prices. Let's find the ways to extract.
And on gas prices, adversity is the mother of invention, isn't it? I mean, we think back to the early days of fracking in America, and we think of what it led to, the reshoring of manufacturing jobs, a collapse in the price of gas in America that meant they were less reliant on what was coming from the Gulf-producing states, and that had big political impacts as well, didn't it? But we know that it was an expensive process, and as gas prices, oil prices rose, it became more doable. And right now, you'd have to say it's doable because actually gas and oil prices are so high.
But the reality is extracting shale gas onshore is cheaper than actually going to the harder parts of the North Sea, where they're talking about whether they actually deliver is a whole different ballgame. But, going to the harder parts of the North Sea is obviously a lot more expensive. And there's a reason why gas prices and electricity prices in the US are half what they are here, give or take. Why? Because they extract shale gas. OK? So that's the opportunity. Imagine saying to everybody, we could halve all our energy prices if we use the treasure under our feet. And actually, this is a massive political debate. I think this will potentially be the big debate alongside the whole debate about net zero and the right way to sensibly, proportionally, affordably reduce our emissions. This is the big story for the next year or two.
Well, Cathy Gingell, you could argue there is a difference with being in the North Sea. The North Sea you tend not to have neighbours when you're in the North Sea. If you're doing this in Lancashire and the nearest house is over there and they're looking at a landscape that looks very different because of shale gas extraction. I mean, Cathy, just a perspective from the other side of the argument.
Well, I object to wind farms hugely from that perspective. So let's put this another way. I think they're an abomination to look at, and nobody's saying what they're going to do when each one comes to the end of its life at after 30 years, and they cost an awful lot of carbon to actually build in the first place, and they're built in China. So the whole policies we've got at the moment are ludicrous. So we have to look at the suggestion that Richard's making now. I don't know what the technology is, but presumably it isn't so obvious. It's not going to be like a great coal pit.
Actually, the extraordinary thing is that the way of drilling, the size of the site, I mean, it's so small you can't believe it. It's a couple of acres. And again, it's the myths that have been perpetuated by a very well-funded, who knows where the money came from, hard to know, very well funded, very smart, very powerful environmental lobby that, they stopped the fracking. And there was a lot of nonsense talked at the time. But I think we need to be optimistic. I think we need to welcome new technologies and say, why wouldn't we be a world leader in finding even better, more environmentally friendly ways of extracting that gas?
And move on from the ones that aren't really working and aren't reliable. I mean, it's in Essex and Suffolk somewhere. I hope I've got. There's going to be fields and fields and fields of solar panels, the biggest solar panel expansion. Now, that is unreliable. It's not reliable for our grid. This is crazy, putting so much money into that, which is certainly more of an eyesore and affects villages around there than the new shale.
Can you both just indulge me for a second? I want to do some media navel gazing. And it's in this regard. I remember, because, Richard, the point is, it was politicians, no matter how good the campaign was, it was the politicians who decided to pull the switch on fracking and say no. But they did so in the teeth of a media campaign that I saw day by day in a previous incarnation. And you would see a reporter turn up with a camera crew live, and a succession of interviews with campaigners and the protesters, sometimes called locals, even though you wondered just how local they were. But it felt a very one-sided argument, and it's a really good illustration of how a relatively small, highly motivated group of campaigners can actually decide policy on the grand scale for tens of millions of people.
Correct, and totally contrary to what people had actually voted for in the 2017 general election, when, let's remind your viewers, in the Tory manifesto was a commitment to create a whole new industry to extract the shale gas using fracking. And voters voted on that basis. So I think actually, yes, it was a very successful campaign on one side, and they achieved a huge amount. But here's the thing. What about let's us be successful on the other side and create a really successful campaign that actually now people have seen the cost of trying to reduce emissions and the cost of saying, OK, I'm going to buy Putin's gas or gas from the Middle East. Actually, that's a huge cost. I think there is a real patriotic desire to say, no, we need to be self-reliant. We've got this treasure. It's British treasure. Let's create British technology and let's go for it.
And what do you say to the detractors who will say, well, hang on a minute, just on fracking, if it's such a great idea, why is nobody else in Europe doing it?
Well, hang on. So, firstly, all over America, they're doing it, and guess what? They've got really cheap gas. Now, yes, America's bigger, but what I'm saying is, look, if you don't like fracking, then come with me and say, OK, then let's invest a combination of some government pump priming money and some private sector entrepreneurial money and look at the new technologies, try them. Because that's how you make progress, Colin. You're not going to make any progress if you just stick to the status quo. If you say, right, let's invest in the latest technology, in the same way, you've got investments into fusion, which is 50-year, 100-year type investment. I'm talking about a 1 to 2 year investment in the latest technology, learn from it, because the treasure, the gold at the bottom of it is extraordinary.
And just on North Sea oil, do you think there are changes? Did you hear something in what Kwasi Kwarteng said that perhaps leads you to think that we are just witnessing a tack in government policy?
There's no question there's a massive tack, because they're panicking. Because actually, if they stick to the current plans, when we're exposed to buying our energy from overseas, and they've suddenly realised that a Tory party that when they took power in 2010 was basically a net exporter of energy in the UK, we're now a massive net importer. We're exposed, we're vulnerable, and the Tory party will be massively vulnerable at the next general election unless they change tack.
Richard, thanks ever so much for coming in. I know Cathy was very worried about your seat. She was worried it was too low at one stage. She managed to sort that out. So.
Well, I know he's so much taller than me, so I didn't want the viewer
This is too much media navel-gazing. Richard Tice, thanks so much for coming in. Thanks very much indeed.